What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back with our Pokemon card auctions of the week recap. Folks, base set is back, baby. With sales we haven't seen since 2020, with some sales even going way beyond 2020 prices. And we also saw an insane BGS 10 Black Label Shining Gyarados that came by, folks. It hit a staggering amount in auction. We're going to go over all of that and more, so please stay tuned to the very end. Today's auction recap sponsor is the one and only lowpopping.com, your source for investment-worthy Pokemon cards. Lowpopping.com currently has some insane vintage cards available on their website, including the always desired base set cards, vintage theme decks, sealed booster packs, uncut sheets, autograph slabs, and so much more. There are tons of PSA, Beckett graded, and CGC graded Pokemon cards on there, and even some graded video games as well. And if something catches your eye, folks, you can still trade for the item or items that you must have for your collection. And don't forget, you can still make offers on anything above $500, and they also have buy now, pay later options at your disposal as well. Lowpopping.com is a tried and true source for high-end investments, and they're always adding new inventory to their website. Go check them out, folks. A link to the site will of course be in the description of this video, and as always, I really appreciate your support. Alright folks, lots of sales to go over. Let's start off with the always controversial Pokemon Celebrations set. Here we have the Ho-Oh from Celebrations in PSA 10 that sold this week for $117.50. And folks, cards like this, cards from Celebrations like this are as common as they get, yet they still sell for over $100. Back in early August, this card was only selling for about $39. Later in August, it sold for about $63, now up to $117.50. But that's not it from Celebrations. We also saw this Xerneas sell as a PSA 10 for $97, and this Lugia that also sold for $182.50. And you might be like me, folks. You might be thinking to yourself, who on earth is paying for these graded Celebrations cards? When in reality, this Lugia right here is hundreds of dollars. Buy it now. It's actually not as available as you might think as a PSA 10. So if you're a Lugia collector or a Celebrations collector, it might be a little bit tougher than you think. A couple of more Celebrations cards. Here is the Mew EX, sold as a PSA 10 for $200, as well as this Dark Sylveon V that sold for $212. And then we saw two sales of the PSA 10 Metal Charizard from the Celebrations UPC. This one here went for $5,953. The other one, $6,800. On to some more very noteworthy modern cards. Here's a CGC 10 Pristine Lugia V from Silver Tempest that sold this week for $1,626. Here's that Drowsy IR from Scarlet and Violet Base, still doing pretty well as a PSA 10, selling this week for $535. Here from Cosmic Eclipse is this Black Label Rainbow Rare Reshiram and Zekrom GX that sold for $2,550 this week. Here is a Ghastly Illustration Rare from Temporal Forces, selling for $420 this week. The Charizard SIR from 151 continues to do extremely well, selling as a PSA 10 for $1,475. And then check this out, folks. Here is a pre-release Staff Gengar Holo from Lost Origin in PSA 10 that sold for $4,735 this week. And then it wouldn't be an auction recap if I didn't cover this guy. It is the PSA 10 Pikachu Van Gogh promo that sold for $2,500. And then we saw a lot of 17 Pikachu Van Gogh promos. I believe 14 of them are sealed and 3 of them were not. Still sold for $10,910. And then folks, we saw not one, not two, but 3 Black Label copies of this Chinese Pikachu art rare with the Gengar there in the background. This one here sold for $10,100. Another one sold for $12,600. Another one here sold for $12,100. And then we saw 2 BGS 10 Pristine copies of the Moonbreon come by. This one here sold for $4,600. The other one sold for $5,600. And then here are 2 insane modern Mewtwo cards. Here's the Mewtwo GX from Shining Legends, sold as a PSA 10 this week for $4,300. And then we have this Mew and Mewtwo GX Black Star promo that got the black label and sold for $13,600. And then just a couple of XY cards. Here's the secret rare Gyarados EX from Breakpoint that sold for $2,075. Here's the full art Lugia EX from Ancient Origins, sold for $2,800. And then lastly, we saw a Venusaur EX Black Star promo from the XY era sell as a PSA 10 for $7,400 this week. And then on to some vintage cards from eBay. We have a couple of base set unlimited cards. We saw the big three come by in PSA 10. Here's the Venusaur that sold for $1,636. The Blastoise sold for $3,552. But it wasn't those two cards that impressed me this week. It was the PSA 10 unlimited base set Charizard that sold in auction for $15,451. And folks, may I remind you, at this card's height, back in early 2021, it used to sell for $17,600 to about $18,450 was the max price this card saw in auction. So we are getting really close here at the price tag of $15,451. Up next was this unlimited Dark Blastoise from Team Rocket set. Sold as a PSA 10 for $2,600, while this unlimited Dark Raichu sold for $2,611. And then the first edition PSA 10 Dark Charizard came by, getting close to its former glory. This used to be a 5-figure card, folks, believe it or not. This week it sold for $8,180. And then a no holo error Dark Dragonite came by in PSA 10 that sold for $5,650. And then we saw a bunch of vintage Gengars that came by. Here is the 1996 Japanese Fossil Gengar. Sold as a PSA 10 for $2,175. And then we saw four Japanese Sabrina's Gengar cards in PSA 10. This is the banned version with the cemetery in the background. This one here sold for $2,750. This one here sold for $2,750 as well. This one sold for $2,850, all the way up to $3,300 for this card. I just couldn't believe we saw 4 PSA 10 examples come by in the same week. And then we saw the PSA 10 Legendary Collection Gengar Holo come by, and it sold for a staggering $14,100. Up next, a couple of crystal cards. Here is a PSA 8 Crystal Charizard from Skyridge that sold for $9,900. And let me just say that a year or two ago, this used to be the price of a PSA 10 copy of this card. Now it's the price of a PSA 8. And then here is the Japanese Crystal Charizard as a PSA 10 that sold for $20,100. Getting into the EX era, we have the Sceptile from EX Ruby and Sapphire. Sold as a PSA 10 for $3,550. Here we have the Rocket Snorlax EX as a PSA 10, sold for $8,522. Here we saw the Reverse Holo Latios from EX Delta Species, sold for an even $3,000 this week, along with the Reverse Holo Rayquaza from EX Delta Species, sold for $5,100. And then a couple of Gold Star sales. Once again, here's a PSA 9 Gold Star Charizard, sold for $13,200. Here's a PSA 8 Gold Star Mudkip that sold for $6,000, while a PSA 9 copy sold for $9,100. And then we saw a BGS 9.5 Gold Star Gary come by, and it sold for $11,100 this week. Here we have a PSA 9 Gold Star Torchic that sold for an even $15,000. And then we saw just 2 Level X cards come by in PSA 10. Here is the Dusknoir from Stormfront that sold for $2,425. While this Mesprit, I think that's how you say it, Level X, sold for $5,522. Here we have the Charizard from Boundaries Crossed, sold for $2,514, while this Charizard from Legendary Treasures sold for $2,074. And then a couple of cards from Call of Legends. Here's the Reverse Holo Rayquaza, sold for $2,370. Here's a Palkia that sold for $3,677, while the Ho-Oh sold for $6,988. On to a couple of sales from alt auctions. Here is the Charizard EX from Fire Red Leaf Green, sold this week for $10,698. Here is a BGS 9.5 Crystal Lugia from Aquapolis, sold for $16,200. Here's that Crystal Charizard yet again. This one's the reverse holo in PSA 10, sold for $6,743, while the regular holo PSA 10 copy sold for an even $39,000. And then finally on alt, we saw this Japanese promo champion number 2 trainer card. I'm not really familiar with this card, but it sold for $60,077, being simply authenticated by PSA. On to the Fanatics Collect weekly and monthly auction block. We have this Rayquaza poncho wearing Pikachu, but it's not the one we're used to seeing. This one here is pretty different, sold for even $6,000. Here is a Black Label Pikachu Stamp Box promo card, sold for $7,500. Here is that Latios GX alt art from Team Up, sold for an even $9,000 this week. And then on to some base set cards. This one here is a base 2 Mewtwo, but hit a new record price as a PSA 10, selling for $4,440. Here is a first edition Hitmonchan from base set in PSA 10, sold for an even $18,000. And the height of this card was back in November of 2020, where it sold for $23,100. So we're getting pretty close to that price. However, we saw this PSA 10 first edition base set Raichu that hit what I believe to be a new record auction price, selling this week for $21,000. And back in November of 2020, this card was selling for about $17,100. So pretty far past the record price, a record auction price. Here's a BGS 9.5 Gold Star Umbreon, sold for $17,400. Here is a first edition PSA 10 German base set Charizard, sold for $17,400. Here's the Charizard Holo from Expedition that hit a new record price, selling as a PSA 10 for $21,600. And then the first edition Shining Charizard from Neo Destiny sold for $21,600 as well. Here we have a BGS 9 2010 Japanese World Championships Representative Masters Key card that sold for $24,900. And then we saw yet another record base set sale. Here's the PSA 10 first edition Mewtwo that sold for $45,600 in auction. And this sale blew way past the previous record sale, where it sold back in November of 2020 for $22,655. And then the final two cards, we have this CGC 10 Pristine Masaki Gengar promo that sold for $46,800. This is a Pop 1 in the CGC Pop Report. And then the auction of the week we got to give to this BGS 10 Black Label Japanese Shining Gyarados that sold for a whopping $90,000 in auction. Folks, that's all I got for you. What'd you think about the Celebrations cards? What'd you think about the base set cards? Let me know in the comments. I always look forward to hearing from you. That's all I got for you today, folks. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will catch you in my next one.